Hello and welcome to another episode of Transport in Africa, a podcast dedicated to spotlight cutting-edge research, innovations, and ideas shaping transport systems across Africa. I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. In each episode, we sit down with a researcher, practitioner, or change maker who is redefining how mobility works in Africa. In today's episode, we are diving into one of the most pressing global challenges of our time, the connection between transportation and climate change. Transportation is the engine of economic growth. It connects people to jobs, markets to consumers, and communities to opportunities. But it is also one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Globally, the transportation sector is estimated to contribute to over 16% of greenhouse gas emissions, and in wealthy countries like Canada and the US, the amount is higher, about 28% and 27% respectively. In Africa, where cities are expanding, populations are growing rapidly, and mobility demand is rising, the transportation sector presents both a major climate challenge and a powerful opportunity for transformation. The question of how do we balance development with sustainability, and what practical steps can African countries take today to transition towards low carbon mobility and climate change mitigations is therefore critical. To help us unpack these critical questions and others, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Samuel Ajayi, whose research focuses on transportation systems, vehicle emissions, and climate change, particularly within the African context. Hello, Dr. Samuel. Good to have you again on this show.
Yeah, good day to you. Thank you so much for bringing me once again. I'm delighted to be here.
So Samuel, before we get into the conversation proper, can you tell us a bit about your professional and personal background?
I'm a transport engineer and researcher, which I specialize in sustainable mobility, transport system planning, and traffic modeling, and the environmental and resilience implication of transport systems. So my academic and professional work has focused on understanding how transport systems intersect with the broader development challenges, particularly with climate change, resilience, infrastructure, and urban sustainability and social equity. Professionally, I serve as a researcher in the Nigerian Building and Road Research Institute. I have a PhD in transport engineering. My work spans transport system analysis, intelligent transport system, mobility planning, and sustainability-oriented transport policy.
For our listeners who are not familiar with this issue, how does urban transportation contribute to climate change, and why is this relationship becoming increasingly important, especially for African cities?
Well, to properly address this question, I think it's very important for me to define climate change. For those that are not familiar with that, climate change just refers to the long-term shift in temperature, in precipitation changes or pattern, and climate variability, which is largely driven today by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So these gases, particularly the carbon dioxide, the CO2, trap air, trap heat, and intensify global warming and disrupt the natural climatic condition or system. So what we are observing today is not just a weather fluctuation. For people who will be wondering what's going to happen, well, it's just a systematic climatic transformation. That's climate change. For example, in Lagos, Nigeria, we do experience towards November, December, we do experience normally harmattan winds, dust haze, cooler temperature. But December 2025, we observed this change, unusual humidity, absence of this harmattan haze. And so scientifically, this reflects climate change in real time. The disruption in these long established seasonal patterns is climate change. And we can see that at the center of it is the urban transportation, which contributes significantly towards it. Why? Because it remains, our transport system remains heavily fossil fuel dependent. It's also the among fastest growing source of greenhouse emissions. And the emissions are amplified by congestion, idling, inefficiency, and aging vehicle fleet in African cities. So this relationship between climate change And transport is very critical for African cities because the transport systems are not only contributors to emissions, but also highly vulnerable to climate impact. So let me just say quickly that climate change affects transport, and also transport affects climate change. So they are interwoven with each other. According to the statistics, the WHO, the African cities are now generating close to 35% of the greenhouse gases emission through transport, which is very alarming because we also have other sources of pollution and emissions. But the transport is contributing more for such now. So we see such effect on the transport. Like I said, transport affects the climate. The climate change also affects transport.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuel, for raising that bi-directional relationship between transportation and climate change, in which both climate change and transportation systems mutually shape each other. Based on your research experience and from this background that you have provided, in what way is climate change already affecting urban transport systems in Africa?
Thank you very much for that question. Climate change is actively reshaping transport systems across African cities. I will group them into 4 pathways. One is the physical pathway, the second is the operational pathway, third is the economic, and the fourth is the safety pathways. This pathway actually represents the mechanism through which climate variability and extreme events influences our infrastructure performance, system efficiency, and financial stability, and the usual risks. So for the physical pathway, that's talking about the infrastructural stress. This refers to the direct impact of climate change on transport infrastructure. African transport networks were largely designed using this historical data assumption that no longer hold. We design our pavements based on old data and not the current realities. So we increasingly observe flood damage to pavements and roads. When there is climate variability, there will be flood on roads, there's drainage system failure. There are also moisture infiltration that's weakening the pavement layers. So the climate change therefore actually reduces the infrastructure durability, the design reliability, and also the structural lifespan of our road pavements. Our cities in Africa must be designed, we must retrofit, we must maintain our infrastructure for evolving climate realities. The second one quickly is the operational pathway, that is the system disruption. Even where our infrastructure is not fully damaged and is we have this climate variability that also affects our system performance, that is our traffic. Include our traffic flows disruption, severe congestion during rainfalls, heavy rainfalls or rainfall events. We have reduced roadway capacity. We have increased travel time variability. And also we have our public transport is not reliable again. So it affects the system. It degrades the mobility efficiency and our network predictability. The third one is the economic pathway, financial consequence. That's another consequence. Of course, we know that it can affect it both direct and indirect economic bodies. We see rising infrastructure maintenance costs. Now, we also see increased rehabilitation expenses or expenditure. Let me say that. We also have higher fuel consumption from congestion. We have productivity loss from delays due to traffic congestion. We have supply chain disruption. The last one is the safety pathway. I think to talk about the risk amplification. Are we safe? That's what I'm about. So climate variability also heightens the safety risks, which includes our road surface degradation. That can cause crashes. We have reduced visibility during rainfall. Of course, the visibility is very poor, low. Also elevated vulnerability of pedestrian and cyclists. So this transport become risk-fied environment under the climate stress.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuel, once more for throwing light on some of the consequences or impacts of climate change on our transportation sector, which are very eminent in most African cities today. Doctor, in your view, what structural, economic, and institutional barriers hinder African cities from reducing transport-related carbon emissions that leads to climate change?
Where the barriers are deeply systematic, actually, they are more systematic. I think structurally, we have a car-centric city where we build the city for cars and not for the people. So we have a cars-centric investment patterns. We have weak or no modal integration, fragmented planning frameworks. We have increased emission intensity. So economically, I can say that sustainable mobility transition and climate resilient infrastructure requires long-term capital investment, but city often operate under fiscal constraints. So there's not that much investment in climate resilient infrastructure actually, which requires a long-term capital investment. But importantly, there's also a major adaptation financing gap. Okay, let me say that. That is the climate resilient roads, the drainage upgrades, and resilient materials demand resources, like I said. Then secondly, institution-wise, we have the policies lacking. There is a policy fragmentation, which is a very critical challenge. Too often we have climate strategies are disconnected from transport planning. We are beginning to incorporate climate strategies or climate adaptation into other sectors, like agriculture, like industrial, but they are not interwoven them into transport planning. We also have adaptation and these mitigation goals. They remain in silos. Different kind of work data in institutions are being done in silos and not coming together to bring evidence-based policy research. So I can say structurally, I can say we are more of car-centric, weak modal integration, economic-wise, not much investment, and then institutional-wise, data and policing are lacking.
One of the most contemporary issues today is transport electrification, which is often seen as a game changer towards cleaner transport systems and climate change mitigations across the world. Doctor, my question is, can electric mobility meaningfully support climate goals in African cities, and what conditions are necessary for success?
Yes, I can say yes to that. Well, electric mobility represents one of the most transformative opportunities for this transport sector decarbonization. I agree. But its climate effectiveness, let me say that, depends on systematic condition. Okay, so from the mitigation perspective, electrification reduces the direct fossil fuel combustion and lowers the transport-related greenhouse gases emission. That's correct, particularly when supported by cleaner. Don't forget, I use the word cleaner. If it's not clean, we are only reducing it, not removing it. Cleaner electricity generation. However, the electric mobility must be examined through a climate adaptation lens. Of course, the awareness is now becoming raised in most African cities about electrification of our transport system. Okay, that's fine. But we must examine it through a climate adaptation lens. That is, our electrification enhances resilience by 1, reducing dependency on volatile fossil fuel. 2, improving long-term energy efficiency. 3, we lower urban heat combustion from combustion engine. That is correct. Also, we enable integration with renewable energy systems. Yet, the electrification is not inherently climate smart, is not yet 100% unless supported by 1, the energy system alignment. That is, the climate benefit of electric vehicles depends on the carbon intensity of the electricity. Very important. A fossil fuel dominated grid limits the limitation gains. And we have such energy issues in most African cities. For example, in Lagos, we have issues with electricity. We don't have enough power supply. That can be a major issue. Number 2 is the infrastructural readiness and resilience. So while we are trying to integrate, are we ready? That's the question. Charging networks, charging stations are not enough. So our charging networks, our grid system must be climate resilient. Flood-prone charging infrastructure undermines reliability. Very important. So we also have the fleet prioritization strategy. Fleet. Is what our fleets they really shared mobility buses, electrifying high utilization fleets, logistic vehicles yield far greater emissions reduction per vehicle. We also have the economic accessibility. Without financing mechanism, the EVs adoption will just remain just like a light driven rather than just system transformation.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I like your stress on the word cleaner, not clean, meaning that we are not totally striving towards clean transport systems, but moving towards cleaner transport systems, which can eventually reduce greenhouse gas emissions and eventually climate change. Dr. Samuel, aside transport electrification, what other realistic strategies can African cities adopt to transition towards low carbon transport systems?
Low carbon transport transition requires systematic, like I said, structural transformation. and not this isolated technological adoption. So effective strategies must simultaneously address emission reduction and climate resilience. Okay? So I can say to recommend realistic strategies based on African realities. But one is the public transport system transformation. Okay, we have the high capacity public transport buses can deliver the largest emission reduction potential when we need to reduce dependency on these our passenger cars, our private cars, and focus on high capacity public transport buses or vehicles. And the climate benefit is very enormous, reduce per capita emission, lower congestion intensity, and they also improve the network efficiency. So number two is the walking and cycling infrastructure. Yeah, the non-motorized transport, which represents inherently zero emission mobility. And the benefit is that is zero operational emission, reduced vehicle dependency. Number three is the climate resilience infrastructure investment. Cities must move beyond traditional design standards. So we must prioritize flood resistance pavements. We now have these solar panel roads. We also enhance drainage system, heat resilient materials. We have the geosynthetic materials for our road pavement design and construction. Adaptive design frameworks. So those are climate resilience infrastructure investments. Then number four, formal transport system, which is very common in most African cities. We must try to modernize them or improve on them because they dominate our African mobility. And then you can say, lastly, for me, the traffic efficiency and the ITS deployment. That is, of course, congestion amplifies emission. One of our studies I did some years ago has profoundly established that increased high congestion increase emissions. So, of course, when we have to deploy ITS systems to manage our traffic, then we'll be having a dynamic response to disruption. It will not be just sudden disruption, and then we have improved network reliability. Our travel time will be reliable. So we have even reduced fuel consumption. We have also lower emission intensity. So recommendation for me, one, I said, looking at the high public transport system transformation, the walking and cycling infrastructure, climate resilience investment, the informal transport system modernization, and also the traffic efficiency and the ITS deployment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samuel. One of the interesting things you raised is about walking and cycling, which usually was the primary and widely used mode of transport. And when cars came in, people saw cars as the future. Today, we are coming back to this primary modes of transport, which is very interesting. And of course, they have the potentials of not only reducing carbon emissions, but also important health benefits for humans. Doctor, what types of urban policies and governance reforms are most urgently needed to align transport systems with climate objectives?
Well, that is a very good question. There are many because we have our issues in Africa, but let me quickly summarize them. There are many. African system requires a paradigm shift towards integrated climate response transport governance. Our governance must be climate responsive. Climate smart transport policy must be embedded both mitigation objectives, that is, in trying to reduce the emissions, and adaptation objectives. So I can say the policy integration, that's number one. My first is the policy integration. Climate goals must be institutionalized within transport planning frameworks. I did design one of the work in Lagos. One of the bridge in Obalende, Lagos, was a lot of issues were there. Safety issues were there. A lot of upon waters issues, diseases were there. So we have to design that place and put green infrastructure, have green grasses grown there to actually mitigate that issue. So we need to integrate policy integration. Number two is the climate risk informed infrastructure design. We need to bring into our design now. Okay, our infrastructure decision must incorporate flood modeling. When we do our road design, we don't really model wind and flood issues there. Climate projection. Okay, what if by next year or in the next 5 years, we have continual or consistent rainfall throughout the months? What will happen to our pavements? And that's also have resilience standards, life cycle risk assessment, very important. So we need to test our pavement life cycle assessment. Number three is the investment, the orientation, orientation. We need to shift away from this car-centric expansion, okay, towards our public transport, towards the NMT system, towards the resilient infrastructure. So there must be a shift in trying to invest in public transport, NMT, and resilient infrastructure. Number next is the regulatory and enforcement strengthening. Okay, policy without enforcement remain in the paper. So critical areas must involve the vehicle standards, our emission regulation, and infrastructure compliance. So there must be strict when we bring policy, we must enforce them. There must be people that are on ground, there must be agencies involved in enforcing and strengthening our policy to work. So the other one is our institution must be coordinated. So integration needed, it is needed across transport agencies. We also need them across urban planning bodies. They must come together. We need them across these environmental authorities and these ministries. So they must coordinate and they must have a policy that define their roles, and they must come together to mitigate these issues. And then we also have the data governance. I speak about data almost all the time. Data climate smart policy requires reliable real-time data, mobility data. Okay, without data, we can't talk about the future. Without data, we cannot even talk about planning. Data is like the thumb in the finger. In my hand now, we have the thumb, we have the other 4 fingers. So the data governance is the thumb that touches all the fingers. So everything we are doing about transport with the climate, we need reliable data. We need the emission inventories. There are also data. We need climate risk assessments. We must be able to take data on our payment, on our infrastructure, on our vehicle, on our mobility issues, transport issues like that. So we also need this equity-centered climate mobility policy. Okay, we must be also, we are talking about our climate smart transport must remain socially inclusive, that the persons with disability can also access it freely, okay, economically viable and accessibility driven. So those are the major core issues that I will recommend for that. So we have the core governance insight. Without the mitigation, the carbon lock-in, then without adaptation, we look at the infrastructural vulnerability. So effective policy requires mitigation plus adaptation plus governance coherence, and then plus enforcement capacity. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Permit me to amplify the point on enforcement of policies. I think this is one of the critical issues, which is a serious challenge to many cities, not only in Africa, but across the world. Very often, cities have been noted for developing or formulating good policies, but when it comes to implementation or enforcing these policies, they are lacking, and that turns out to work negatively towards some of goals that we have for our cities. So policies should be associated with enforcement mechanisms aimed at realizing these policies. Doctor, before we wrap up this conversation, what gives you optimism or concerns regarding transport and climate change in African cities? And what final message will you want our listeners to take from this conversation?
Well, my response, optimism, it's about our growing awareness. Our awareness is still very low in African cities about climate resilient cities. It's still very low. So my concerns is about that. Like growing awareness, emerging innovations, and expanding our research more on climate resilient research, and also policy dialogue momentum. So policy, most Africans are lacking the climate resilient policy or sustainable climate resilient policy. We are using the old policy. We're not aligning the policy to reflect the current realities. Now, people are not really aware about climate change. Just felt where maybe the weather has changed. I can tell you that currently now in Lagos, we're now, since the beginning of the year, 2026, we now have increased rainfall, which is it's abnormal. Before, rainfall started around March, April, but now we have been experiencing rainfall since December last year. So people just think, where the weather has changed. That's climate change. So it means we need to change and a shift in our thinking. African cities can leapfrog unsustainable models. Concerns is the rapid motorization growth. Of course, we have people are growing, population is increasing. Where people buy cars are now increasing. So that's why we need to reduce dependency of buying cars on people trying to take the high capacity buses or diversify from the road transport. We have so much in Africa depend on the road transport. almost all our heavy goods are now going towards the road, where we can diversify into rail. So we need to work on rail system and improve on that so that we can reduce dependency on the road transport system. So my concern is that. My also look at the infrastructural exposure. Our roads are already exposed to these climate variability now. We have weak enforcement, like you said, weak enforcement. In fact, some places no enforcement. I also have the adaptation financing gap. That's one of my issues. Do we have enough fund to actually pilot this work? Do we have enough fund to actually give grant to researchers to start looking at climate resilience and transport systems? So for final reflection, I will say that transport is no longer simply a mobility issue. No, it's not. It is a climate mitigation issue. It's also an economic stability issue and urban resilience issue. So this is not sustainable, but it is fixable. So we possess the knowledge. We have these tools. What's required now is the decision, coordination, and our climate responsive action that simultaneously addresses emissions, like I said, emission reduction, infrastructure resilience, and equitable mobility. So transport policy is now climate policy. Let me say that again. Transport policy is now climate policy, and climate policy must be transport smart. Thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of this episode of your podcast on transport in Africa. Dr. Samuel, thank you very much for sharing your insights on transportation and climate in Africa. I wish you all the best in your professional journey.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and I believe that Africa will be great.
If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, please consider subscribing to our page. You can also contribute by sharing this podcast with friends and colleagues who are interested in transport and mobility issues in Africa. If you are a researcher or practitioner working on transport in Africa and would like to share your work on this platform, feel free to reach out to me at chebechesifu@campus.technion.ac.il and we can discuss how to feature your work on this show. Until next time, I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. Thanks for listening and